Tim Riley out with a new book, Lennon, the man, the myth, the music, the definitive life, and there's so much to talk about here, Tim. The one thing that jumps out, though, and you would never guess it by looking at the cover, is the fact that drugs fueled much of Lennon's creativity to such a degree that there's one moment during Let It Be where they're flat. And you would ask an Apple insider, is that because they were mourning the loss of a child?
Right.
And the answer was?
It was the most amazing interview I did for this project, and he's an Apple insider, and he was there, and he knew.
Right.
And he said, no, he just waved me off. He said, you're way off on that. They weren't mourning the miscarriage. He had been on heroin, and we all knew it, all through 1968, and we were glad, because it got him off acid.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And so it gave me this whole new picture of how much he had been abusing acid, that his bandmates were happy that he had graduated to heroin, and that he'd been snorting heroin all the way through 1968. Now, and he saw my jaw drop, and he said, well, you have to understand, in 1968, the way heroin was perceived in the culture, we didn't have all these casualties. We didn't have a Janis Joplin or Jimi Hendrix or Jim Morrison. We didn't have these cautionary tales out there. And it was an expensive drug. It was an elitist drug, and
in 67, 68, 69, obviously he was on a lot of drugs, something that Lennon himself later on would lament, because he said, I basically ceded the band over to Paul McCartney for a couple of years because I was so out of it.
Yeah. And there's a famous story of his showing up at a Sgt. Pepper session, and he starts to feel woozy, and he says, I need some fresh air. And George Martin, the producer, takes him up to the roof, and he realizes that instead of taking an upper, what he thought he was taking, he had taken a tab of acid.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he couldn't function. So yes, no, he's a very, very, it's a very strong cautionary tale for Lennon and his drug abuse, and more than one person I talked to said it's amazing that he lived through it. And the more fascinating thing that I try and write about in the book is that his songwriting and his companionship with his fellow Beatles pulled him through somehow. And
pulled him through. The same thing with Yoko and the need for Yoko. I want to read a quote from your book also, which really talks about why he was such a tortured artist for his 40 years. The worst pain is of not being wanted or realizing your parents do not need you in the way you need them. When I was a child, I experienced moments of not wanting to see the ugliness. This lack of love went into my eyes and into my mind. Obviously, his father abandoned him. His mother was off and on until she got killed. He lived with his aunt. That's all he had. That was his family.
Yeah. And so those bonds, those intimate bonds that most of us take for granted of, having stable family situations, mother and father that we can look up to and rely on, at least one parent, he didn't have that. And I think that it affected every single intimate relationship that he ever had in his whole life. And you can see it play out throughout his life. For me, the interesting part was, how did that play out in musical terms? Mm-hmm. So I think Strawberry Fields Forever is one of the great one of the great pop songs of all time. It's a deeply intimate song about what it felt like to be John Lennon, the child.
Right, and of course, Eric Bates, the moment the Beatles broke up and he did Plastic Ono Band, he just ripped the bandage off.
Yeah, well, both of the things you're talking about, his relationship with Yoko and his drug use, were things that he was really attacked for, and other band members had real issues with, but they were also really core to him, to who he was and to how he created his art. So there's a real kind of contradiction there.
Well, absolutely, big contradiction. It also tells us how we tend to think about him very differently long after he died than we did at the time when he was alive. When he was alive, he was a very controversial guy. I mean, he couldn't open his mouth without getting into trouble. And there were people who, we adore him now. It's a universal adoration we feel for Lennon, the myth, now. But when he was alive, he could not. He got into trouble on a daily basis just because he was a loose cannon. He would say what was on his mind. It was often sharp and political and incendiary, and it made a lot of people mad.
Absolutely loved New York City.
Oh, he
absolutely adored America, and yet he couldn't get a green card for 5 years because the government was afraid of him. Al Sharpton.
Well, but let me ask you this: was his relationship with Yoko Ono was that answering some of his childhood anxiety with his parents? Was that part of the glue? Was she fitting something psychically that he needed?
Yes. So the received idea about Yoko Ono is that she fulfills this mother role that he'd been looking for a long time. But I think it's the myth about Lennon, it tends to be so simplistic I think it's actually much more interesting and much more complicated than that, because I think that she showed him a whole world that he'd never known before. One of my favorite quotes of his is from 1970 when he says, "I went to art school, and I'm really angry that they never told me about Marcel Duchamp at my art school." And so what that tells me is that Yoko is telling him about the history of modernism, the history of modern art.
Right, he saw their relationship as an artistic partnership as much as anything.
Almost more so, almost primarily an artistic relationship.
This is going to be absolutely fascinating to read. Thank you so much, Tim Riley. The book is Lennon, the Man, the Myth, the Music. We'll be right back. You're watching
Thank you,
Morning
Tim.
Joe.
Looks great.